Millersfield was the kind of town that wrapped its traditions around itself like a wool shawl, quiet, tight-knit, humming with the soft rhythm of routine, and anchored by a shared belief in good neighbors and familiar names. And no name was more familiar, more revered, than the Millers. Charles and Rose Miller were as close to royalty as a town like Millersfield could ever hope to know. Generous benefactors, hosts of the annual Harvest Fair, patrons of the school's music program, and smiling faces at every bake sale, charity auction, and civic ceremony. Their stately brick home on Harper Ridge stood watch over the town like a sentinel, its windows always glowing with warm light, its hedges neatly trimmed, its white columns wrapped each December in garlands the children helped hang. The Millers had no children of their own, or at least none the town ever saw, but they loved the children of Millersfield with a fierceness that bordered on holy. They funded scholarships, bought band uniforms, paid for orphan medical bills, and when a church's roof caved in during the storm of '63, it was Charles Miller who covered the entire cost without asking for a word of thanks. People said that Charles came from money and Rose from mystery. She was a quiet woman with a voice like smoke and eyes that always looked just beyond you, as if watching something arrive behind your shoulder. But together they were a pillar, the spine of Millersfield, steady and upright. They lived modestly, despite their wealth, and every Thanksgiving, they opened their home to the whole town. It was an unspoken tradition. Anyone without a place to go could walk up the Miller steps, and Rose would greet them in an apron stained with flour and cranberry, her hands warm and her eyes distant, but kind. No one questioned how they sustained such wealth. No one asked why their phone never rang in public. No one wondered why no deliveries ever came to the back door. They were the Millers. And in a town like Millersfield, that meant something. It meant you didn't pry. You accepted kindness without suspicion. You believed in the good in people, especially those who smiled and gave freely. The town itself bore their name, after all, or so everyone believed. And though the county records show that Millersfield existed long before Charles and Rose arrived in 1924, people preferred the legend, that the town grew up around them, that their goodness shaped the place, that their name was the foundation. But time has a way of peeling paint off truth. And long before the flood, there were signs. Tiny cracks in the perfect surface. Children whispering stories about strange humming coming from the direction of Harper Ridge at night. A dog that went missing and was later found hairless and silent, unable to bark, staring into nothing. A farmer who claimed the well water near the Miller estate had turned thick for 3 days, like syrup, before it cleared on its own. No one believed him. Not really. People muttered about old pipes and bad weather, and when he left town 6 months later without saying goodbye, his name faded from conversation like steam from a teacup. That was the way things went in Millersfield. You didn't speak ill of the people who made your town better. You certainly didn't question them. And so the Millers remained the town's pride, its shining emblem. The Miller house was used in postcards. High school kids took prom pictures on the front lawn. And every 4th of July, Charles would give a speech from the gazebo he paid to rebuild after the lightning fire of '57, his voice strong and clear, telling stories of the town's greatness, of its resilience, of its values. People clapped. People believed. People needed to believe. Because belief in Millersfield was safer than curiosity. But beneath that belief, buried deep like sediment under still water, was a truth that no one wanted to name. The Millers had secrets, and the town had helped bury them. A man named Peter Roche, a former history teacher, had once tried to dig into the Miller family tree. He claimed there were no birth certificates for either Charles or Rose. No census records. No photographs before 1924. When he presented this at a town meeting, people laughed. Then they frowned. Then they told him he was stirring up trouble. Within the year, Peter Roche moved away. No forwarding address. His house was sold at auction, contents already emptied. His old classroom was given to a new teacher who said the desk drawer was sticky with something like sap, something that smelled like copper and salt. No one looked into it. The Millers continued to host their dinners. Charles aged gracefully. Rose didn't seem to age at all. People joked about her miracle skin and otherworldly grace, and Rose would laugh politely and say she just drank a lot of tea. But something changed in the air every time she entered a room. Some shift in the temperature, a thinning of the noise, like the moment before a hymn begins in church. Some people noticed. Most didn't. And life in Millersfield carried on, uninterrupted, until the flood came. It arrived in June of 1971, unseasonal and fierce, an angry river birthed from a week of unrelenting storms. The riverbanks burst, roads drowned, basements filled like bathtubs, and the Miller estate, perched high but not high enough, was ravaged by water and silt and rot. It was the first time in 50 years that the public had been inside the Miller basement. And it was the last time anyone in Millersfield ever spoke the Miller name with reverence. What they found beneath that house, the door that hadn't been visible before, the air that shivered when you breathed it, the rows of jars sealed with wax and carved symbols, the stone steps that descended deeper than any foundation should, was not just a stain on the town's history. It was a revelation, a reckoning, a fracture that could no longer be ignored. And so the story begins not with horror, but with trust, with affection. With a town that loved its heroes so dearly, it forgot that even heroes can lie, especially the ones who never stop smiling. The storm began the way many disasters do, in whispers. The radio crackled with vague warnings, the sky grumbled with a voice too deep to ignore, and Millersfield, wrapped in its usual rhythm of lawn care and lemonade, turned its eyes upward with the kind of cautious optimism reserved for Midwestern summers. June had come heavy with heat that clung like wet cotton, and by the sixth day of clouds, even the birds had stopped singing. At first, the townspeople assumed it would pass. It always had before. The Harper River had risen plenty of times in their grandparents' stories. Old-timers remembered muddy roads and wet shoes, nothing more. But this storm was different. It rolled in slow and thick, like ink poured across the horizon, and with it came a wind that moaned through the trees like something wounded and ancient. The rain didn't fall, it attacked. Sheets of water slammed down, so hard it flattened cornfields in minutes. Gutters overflowed. Power lines sparked. Streets became rivers. And for the first time in over 40 years, the foundation of the Miller estate groaned loud enough for the town to hear. People who lived along Harper Ridge said they heard a deep, low snap, like a spine breaking, followed by a tremble in the earth. Lightning struck the Miller chimney. The lights inside flickered, then vanished. And yet no one answered the phone when the neighbors called to check on them. That night, Millersfield was swallowed in darkness. Power failed across the grid. Emergency crews couldn't reach half the town. Trees fell. The river crested over the bridges. A section of Route 9 caved in and took a delivery truck with it. At the southern edge of town, the cemetery gates burst open and headstones tipped like teeth in soft gums. It wasn't just water, it was upheaval, as if the ground itself had grown tired of holding its secrets. At the center of it all was the Miller house, now leaning at a slight, unnatural angle, its pristine lawn shredded, its garden uprooted, the white paint on its columns peeling like old skin. By morning, the rain slowed to a drizzle, but the damage had been done. Harper Ridge was nearly unreachable by car. Dozens of basements were submerged. The church's stained glass windows had shattered inwards. Sandbags floated like corpses. But what drew the most attention, once the water receded just enough, was the Miller estate's basement, where a chunk of the stone wall had collapsed in the flood, revealing a section of the house no one had known existed. Volunteers from the local fire department and some of the neighborhood men arrived to assess the damage. Charles and Rose were nowhere to be found. The front door was unlocked, swinging open on its hinges, creaking every time the wind passed. The inside of the house looked strangely untouched, dry, clean, almost preserved, as if the storm hadn't dared enter. That made the basement all the more confusing. The collapse exposed what appeared to be a sealed chamber behind the foundation. The stone was older than the rest of the house, rough, blackened, marked with strange indentations like weather-worn symbols. It wasn't just a room, it was a door. A door without a knob, almost grown into the rock like it belonged there long before the Millers did. The fire chief, a man named Henry Dobbs, ordered the area cordoned off. But photos were already taken. News spread. And that night, despite the warnings, a few curious townsfolk returned. They brought lanterns, cameras, shovels. They cleared debris. They found that the stone door could be pried loose, just enough to slide open a gap, just enough to smell what lay beyond. It was not rot. It was not mold. It was cold and metallic, like old coins and wet iron. A stillness lived beyond the crack, thick as syrup, and as they widened the gap, the air inside shifted, not outward, but inward, pulling gently at their breath, as if the basement itself were inhaling. That was when they stopped. One man, Eugene Harrelson, who ran the hardware store, claimed he heard humming. A child's hum, low and rhythmic, coming from the other side. Another swore he saw a flicker of light, like the glint of a lantern swinging at the end of a long hallway. No one went inside that night. They sealed the gap with plywood and nails, marked it off with tape, and promised to return with officials in the morning. But by dawn, 2 of the men who'd been there were missing. Their families hadn't seen them since the night before. Their vehicles were still parked outside. Inside the Miller basement, the plywood was split clean down the middle, like something had peeled it open from the inside. The doorway now gaped wider, blacker, and the air that drifted from it was warmer than before, moist, whispering against the skin like breath. Inside the Miller home, something had changed. The walls had begun to sweat. Mirrors refused to reflect. Every clock inside the house, mantle, wristwatch, digital, had stopped at 2:14 a.m. The grandfather clock in the parlor had no hands at all. The town council met in emergency session, trying to determine what to do. Some wanted to demolish the house. Others insisted on a formal investigation. But one man, Joseph Pine, the town's historian, brought a file no one had seen before. It was a blueprint. An original design of the Miller house, drawn up in 1925 before its construction. And on the plans, scribbled faintly in pencil, was a note near the foundation. Cavity beneath must not be disturbed. Harmonics unstable. The council fell silent. Joseph admitted he found the plans years ago, buried in a mislabeled archive box at City Hall, but he hadn't thought much of them. Until now. They decided to send a team down, formally, with officials and cameras and documentation. But none of them would speak about what was found. None of the footage was ever released. And by the end of the week, 2 more people vanished. The Millers were still missing. Their portraits were taken down from City Hall. The annual Miller-funded fair was quietly canceled, and whispers took root across Millersfield like mildew, about children who had vanished in the 1930s, about a room with no corners, about a hum you could only hear when you were alone. The flood had not just drowned the land. It had washed away the lies. And behind those lies, the basement waited. The morning air hung heavy with mist and the sour aftertaste of flood rot, as if the earth itself were reluctant to exhale what had been disturbed. The Miller estate sat like a soaked relic on its crumbling hill, its once perfect lawn now a swamp of broken roots and river silt, the white facade stained brown from water lines and debris. Volunteers moved with a cautious reverence, not out of respect for the Millers, whose absence had begun to feel more accusatory than tragic, but for the house itself, which no longer seemed like a place that welcomed people. The damage to the basement was more severe than first believed. Structural engineers noted how the foundation didn't collapse so much as pull away, as though a vacuum had formed behind the stone, sucking inward and splintering support beams. What was visible through the broken section was not a normal crawl space or utility room. It was a long, shallow descent into a space that had no right being beneath a family home. A tunnel-like slope, slick with mud and old brick, led down into a chamber that did not appear on any blueprint. The air was still damp, but not from the flood. It smelled ancient, untouched by the elements, tinged with minerals and something almost sweet, like rotting sugar or spoiled fruit left in the sun too long. The team tasked with clearing debris began removing waterlogged beams, expecting more earth or perhaps remnants of old cellar storage. Instead, they uncovered the first set of stones, black, porous, irregular slabs arranged in a semicircle, marked faintly with carvings that resisted description. One volunteer, a young man named Travis, touched a carving and immediately recoiled, claiming he felt something shift under the skin of the stone. Others dismissed it, blaming nerves or damp cold. But as more of the space was revealed, discomfort grew into unease. The floor was not level, but gently sloped toward a pit at the far end, filled with stagnant water, so black it didn't reflect light. Floating in that water were objects that no one could identify at first, until someone reached in with a hook and pulled up what looked like an old doll, cloth decayed and hollow-eyed, its mouth sewn shut with wire. Beneath it, the hook caught something harder, a small wooden chair, child-sized, tethered to a chain that disappeared into the muck. The discovery halted all movement. Phones were brought out to take photos, but none of the pictures would save. Devices glitched, screens went black, batteries drained instantly. Cameras with film fared no better. The rolls would later be developed with nothing but smears and static. Henry Dobbs, who'd been overseeing the site since the initial collapse, ordered a halt to the digging. He called for county support, but the line dropped twice, and when he finally reached someone, the call was recorded as coming from outside the service zone, even though he was standing square in the center of Millersfield. That night, he didn't go home. He sat in his truck outside the Miller house, watching the lightless windows and listening to the faint dripping of water inside the open basement hatch. According to his wife, he returned home at dawn, pale and shaking, and refused to speak for 2 full days. When asked later what he saw or heard, he simply said, "There was movement, but not like people. Like ideas trying to take shape." The town council grew divided. Some wanted the house boarded and condemned. Others insisted it be preserved until a proper investigation could be conducted. The mayor, whose own children had reportedly begun sleepwalking and murmuring about the bottom stairs, begged for federal intervention, but no one came. Reports were filed and forgotten. State officials claimed jurisdictional conflicts, and still the water beneath the Miller house remained, not draining, not drying, just present. A puddle without a source. One brave woman, a graduate student in folklore named Carrie Luthen, managed to lower a hydrophone into the pit. What she recorded lasted only 36 seconds before the device shorted out. The playback was a garbled mix of whispers and rhythmic knocks, but at the 22-second mark, a voice clear and unmistakable said the words, "Don't follow the stairs when they change." That recording would later be lost in a mysterious file corruption. Carrie herself left town shortly after, citing migraines and episodes of waking déjà vu. She told a friend she dreamed of a staircase that led nowhere and everywhere at once, with no walls, no ceilings, just endless descent lined with chairs and wet dolls. When asked what was at the bottom, she would shake her head and say, "There isn't a bottom. Just a reflection of something older than the town." Despite the warnings, people kept approaching the basement, some out of curiosity, some out of a compulsion they couldn't explain. Neighbors claimed to see figures standing near the broken wall late at night, silent silhouettes, unmoving, like statues made of water and shadow. One child reported seeing his missing cat down there, floating in the air, its eyes glowing gold, before it melted into the wall. Parents kept their children indoors. Schools shortened hours. Churches filled more often, but prayers felt hollow. No one mentioned the Millers anymore. Their names felt cursed, like invoking them would make the walls bleed again. In a desperate attempt to close the site, a concrete truck was brought in to fill the chamber. But the cement never settled. It disappeared slowly, steadily, into the pit, as if the earth beneath were swallowing it whole. 2 full trucks emptied into the void, and still the chamber yawned, patient and unfilled. They gave up by the 3rd. Local papers stopped reporting on it. The police shifted focus. Only a small group of townspeople continued to gather outside the house each week, watching, waiting, whispering. They began to draw circles in the dirt, spirals with uneven lines. Some claimed it helped. Others said it made the dreams worse. But everyone agreed on one thing: the flood hadn't broken the basement. It had released it. And whatever had been held there, by stone, by ritual, by silence, was now listening again. Beneath the Miller house, beneath the water that would not dry, beneath the floor that hummed when no one stood on it, something ancient had begun to stir. The moment the seal broke, nothing happened, and that in itself was terrifying. There was no flash of light, no thunderclap, no screams from beyond the veil. Just silence, sudden and unnatural, as though the very breath of the town had been caught in its throat. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon under a sky too gray to be natural, when the clouds pressed low against the rooftops and every dog in town fell quiet at once. It wasn't a formal team that did it. Not professionals. Not the county or the state. Just 4 local men, each with their own reasons, their own quiet obsessions, drawn to the Miller basement not by duty, but by something deeper, something needling at the edges of their dreams. They had seen the chamber. They had felt its pull. And they told no one what they planned. They didn't need to. It was as if the house had whispered to them directly, bypassing the rules of language and reason. One of them, Dennis, the postmaster, had begun waking with mud under his fingernails, though he hadn't left his bed. Another, Neil, had seen his reflection blink twice while he shaved. By the 3rd day, he no longer used mirrors. They gathered at dusk with flashlights and a crowbar, approaching the jagged maw of the foundation as if it might close at any moment. The plywood barrier was gone, torn or dissolved, no one knew. The entrance stood open, breathing a slow, fetid draft that smelled of rust and spoiled herbs. Inside, the stairs led not downward but inward, spiraling into a space that defied architectural sense. Walls curved in impossible angles. Stones shimmer with moisture, but left no wetness when touched. The air changed temperature with every step. And in the center of that chamber, on a dais carved from some unidentifiable stone, was the seal. It was not a door, not in the conventional sense. It looked like a lid over an old well, but wider, flatter, etched with symbols that seemed to squirm if stared at too long. The surface pulsed, almost imperceptibly, like the slow rhythm of a thing asleep. The four men stood in silence around it. Not one spoke. Not one asked why they were there. They simply began to pry. The crowbar bent. The stone shrieked, not loud, not sharp, but deep like whale song underwater, a sound you felt in your molars and spine. When the seal cracked open, only slightly, a breath of air escaped so cold and old that it tasted of bones. Beneath it was darkness, not the absence of light, but the presence of something that devoured it. One man leaned too far, and his flashlight dropped in. It did not clatter. It did not shine. It vanished like a coin into deep water. The man leaned back, trembling, tears running down his face though he hadn't blinked. Then something rose. It did not climb or emerge. It became. A shape, not quite seen but deeply felt, filled the room. It did not move. It did not speak. But all four men knew it had noticed them. And that was enough. Dennis fell to his knees, clutching his ears though no sound rang. Neil backed into the wall, muttering the spiral is inside now over and over. The others fled, half blind, stumbling up the warped stairs into a night that had grown too still. Over the next week, strange things began to happen. A thin frost formed in the Miller garden each morning, even as temperatures rose into the 80s. Birds began crashing into windows at City Hall. A child claimed her imaginary friend was now too loud and asked if her thoughts could be returned. People began seeing things in mirrors, things behind them, things that weren't there when they turned. The postmaster stopped delivering mail altogether. He simply stood at the town square each morning, eyes closed, whispering names no one recognized. The county was called again. This time they came. A team of 8, including engineers and environmental specialists, arrived on Friday. They entered the house and never came out. Their van remained parked at the curb. Radio stopped responding. By Sunday, it was gone, vanished in the night, without tracks, without sound. Just gone. Some said they saw lights in the woods that night, floating, slow, not quite attached to anything. Others claimed to hear music, low and warbled, like something played backward on an old gramophone. Meanwhile, the chamber grew colder. Neighbors reported frost on the inside of their windows, even without electricity. Shadows no longer moved in accordance with light. People began leaving town. Quietly, without packing, without farewells. Just gone. Stores closed. The schools shut down temporarily. Church services doubled, but the pews were mostly empty. The preacher's voice cracked more often now, and he kept glancing at the back wall of the chapel, where the paint bubbled in the shape of concentric circles. A meeting was called. The few remaining council members decided to collapse the Miller house entirely. A demolition crew was scheduled, but the night before the raising, the entire team disappeared. Their equipment was found twisted, melted, embedded halfway into the street like it had sunk through hot wax. No one spoke of trying again. The seal had been broken. The thing beneath the house was not sleeping anymore. And Millersfield was not a town anymore. It was a gate. People began drawing the spiral symbol in the dirt, on their walls, on their skin. Some claimed it protected them. Others claimed it helped the thing find them faster. Reports came in of a woman seen walking the outskirts of town, barefoot, eyes black, her mouth moving silently as if chanting in reverse. When approached, she vanished like steam. The mayor stepped down. The preacher vanished. And those who remained no longer asked questions. They simply waited. Because something was coming. Something that had waited a long time. Something that had been sealed not by accident, but for a reason older than language. And now, with the seal broken, the spiral had begun to turn. The spiral beneath the Miller house was not a design, nor a symbol, nor a trick of architecture. It was a movement, a principle, an intent buried in stone. After the seal had been broken, Those few brave or foolish enough to peer into the chamber would describe the space not as a basement, but as something shifting, mutable, alive in a way that buildings were never meant to be. The floor, once firm and cracked with water damage, now sloped subtly but impossibly, always inward, always downward, as though the house itself were folding. And where once there had been a pit, there was now a corridor, not built, but formed, wet with condensation, lined with walls that pulsed ever so slightly, as if they remembered being something else. No one who ventured deeper could say how far it went. Distances unraveled. Steps multiplied or reversed. Time slowed to a syrupy crawl, or sped up until entire days vanished in a blink. But always, there was the spiral. It began as a design on the walls, crudely carved at first, then more precise, fractal, infinite. A single, unbroken line looping in on itself, never quite touching the center, never allowing escape. Carrie Luthen, the folklore student who had recorded the basement's hum before vanishing from town, had once written in her notebook that spirals were among the oldest religious shapes, older than crosses, older than stars. In her final entry, she'd scribbled, "They are not symbols. They are instructions." That was instructions, or perhaps ritual, that the Miller house now demanded. People were being pulled in, not physically at first, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. A janitor from the high school walked 8 miles barefoot and entered the basement without ever speaking a word. He was found later, curled at the spiral's center, his eyes wide open, blood seeping from his nose and ears. He could not speak, but he scribbled in a child's handwriting the words, "It needs patterns." He died 3 days later. Local animals began to vanish. Then birds stopped flying over the property altogether. The spiral's pull was growing. On a Thursday, a teacher named Linda Doss claimed to have dreamed of the spiral. Except it wasn't in the house, it was beneath her school, carved into the gymnasium floor. She refused to go near the building afterward. When forced to, she collapsed at the threshold, whispering the numbers for 7 over and over as if counting something invisible. A sheriff's deputy who'd been assigned to watch the property started journaling his shifts. The entries were mundane at first. No movement, all quiet. Then the tone shifted. "The house is listening now," he wrote. I coughed and the walls echoed it back before the sound left my mouth. In his final entry, he wrote, "There's a spiral under my skin. I can feel it every time my heart beats." He was never seen again. His patrol car was found with the engine running and a tape looped in the deck, 10 seconds of static over and over. And still, no agency arrived to shut the house down. Millersfield's map listings began to glitch. GPS systems redirected away from the address. Online searches produced errors. Something, whether the thing in the spiral or something acting in defense of it, was erasing the town in pieces. Then came the dreams. Those still in town began to report identical nightmares. A spiral staircase descending forever, lined with chairs facing inward, each occupied by a child with no face. At the center, a figure that never moved but whose presence was unbearable. Some awoke screaming. Others awoke silent, unable to speak for hours. A few never woke at all. Hospitals began to fill, not with injuries, but with catatonia. People who had nothing wrong with them physically, but whose minds had turned inward, spiraled down, and refused to return. Doctors left. Nurses quit. And soon, there were no diagnoses at all, just more names added to a growing list of the silent. The spiral was not content to stay beneath the house. People began to draw it compulsively. Children etched it into their desks. Teenagers tattooed it into their thighs with safety pins. A woman was found in her bathtub, the spiral carved into her back with a mirror shard. Her final message, left in condensation on the bathroom mirror, read, "Every path leads inward." And inward the town went. Houses emptied. Businesses shuttered. Mail piled up. Phones stopped ringing. But the Miller house, its lights now flickering on at night despite having no power, stood pristine, untouched by decay, its windows always slightly ajar as if watching. A rumor spread that someone had followed the spiral to its end. A drifter, nameless, who entered during a thunderstorm and never returned. But a week later, a note was found nailed to the church doors, written in blocky, unsteady letters. "There's no end. It curves in on itself. It's not a path. It's a hunger." The paper was damp, but not from rain. It reeked of the basement's rot, and people stopped asking who had placed it there. Instead, they started locking their doors earlier. They refused to say the word spiral aloud. Some tried burning their drawings. They always reappeared. The preacher tried to bless the house one final time. He entered with 3 crosses, 2 flasks of holy water, and a recording of choral hymns. Only the hymns returned, looping through town speakers the next morning in reverse. The preacher was never found. His Bible was recovered in the middle of the street, pages all torn except one, which had been circled in ash. And the pit shall open, and from it shall rise smoke like the smoke of a great furnace. The spiral, it seemed, had become more than a curse. It was a mechanism. It did not want worship. It wanted repetition. It wanted mirrors and loops and patterns repeating themselves until the world folded into itself. And Millersfield was no longer resisting. The people were spiraling. The land was spiraling. And the space beneath the Miller house, though still not fully visible, had begun to widen. Rooms formed that had never been built. A hallway appeared, always leading left, even when turned right. Those who entered came out wet, shivering, their hair streaked with white, eyes unable to focus on straight lines. A final report from a man named Harris, who claimed to have descended into the spiral's 3rd chamber, was mailed to the library 3 days before he vanished. The report read, "There is no end. There is only the fold. We are the seam. We were never meant to open it. But now it cannot be closed. The spiral is beneath everything. Beneath us. Beneath time. And it is waking." Long before the Miller house was built, before roads were paved and fields tilled and street signs hammered into the earth, the land where Millersfield now sat had already known the spiral. That truth began to surface as the town unraveled, not in official reports or archaeological discoveries, but in whispers from the old, scribbles found in forgotten attics, and the fading diaries of settlers long dead. It was as if the land had been waiting, quietly, for its own story to be remembered. The phrase, "We were the seam," first appeared carved into the wood beneath the floorboards of the original Millersfield church. The structure burned down in 1891 under suspicious and unexplained circumstances. The carving was only discovered because the new pastor, while preparing to leave town, decided to inspect the old grounds, claiming he was drawn to a rhythm he could feel under his feet. He never finished his inspection. A local boy found his shoes and coat folded neatly beside the church foundation. The phrase was carved dozens of times beneath the flooring, in different handwritings and different depths, as though multiple generations had knelt there, over and over, recording the same realization. We were the seam, not the keepers, not the protectors. The seam itself, the place where something was stitched closed, and now ripped open. It reframed everything the townsfolk thought they understood about the Miller family, about the house, about the town's purpose. Perhaps the Millers were not cursed, but custodians. Perhaps the house was not a home, but a lock. And perhaps the flood was not an accident, but a release. As people fled the town or disappeared into the spiral, as reality began to twist in ways too subtle to detect at first, those who remained were left with one truth. They had always been part of it. Not separate. Not victims. Participants. A seam implies 2 sides stitched together, something kept apart deliberately through force or design. But with time, seams wear. Threads fray. And what's beneath presses outward, testing its constraints. The spiral, once hidden, was now everywhere. Not just beneath the Miller house, but under the school, the church, the grocery store. Cracks formed in sidewalks and revealed curling lines of black stone. Wallpaper peeled in swirling patterns. The cornfields around town grew in bent rows, always curling left, never crossing. Even the birds flew in tight spirals until they dropped from exhaustion. In their final days, the town's archivist attempted to catalog historical references to spirals in Millersfield's records. She found that every mayoral seal had a faint looping motif around its border. The original town plans, long thought lost, were uncovered in a library wall and showed the streets forming an unmistakable inward curl, designed from the beginning to direct movement toward the center, toward the Miller property, or the seam. She never finished her report. She was last seen sitting in the town square, eyes closed, humming a melody that looped every 7 seconds. Her final typed page contained only 4 words, repeated again and again until the paper ran out. It was always us. No one knew who built the original foundation that the Miller house stood on. It predated the town registry. Surveyors who attempted to scan it reported inconsistent depth readings. Some claimed the basement was deeper than the height of the house. One machine read an echo at 220 feet. Another said infinity. After the spiral widened, volunteers attempted to map the space. They failed. No two maps matched. One showed 5 rooms, another 21. Hallways would vanish and reappear. The staircase descended for 3 hours and led the cartographer back to the surface. The basement had become a place of recursion, a structure made of loops, not walls. And every time someone entered, it grew. Not just spatially, but emotionally, metaphysically. It learned. It remembered. And with each descent, the spiral deepened its grasp on the town's psyche. Dreams now came not just at night, but during waking hours. People would freeze mid-conversation, eyes flicking back and forth like reading invisible lines. Some reported seeing themselves across the street or hearing their own voices echoing from places they hadn't been. Time stuttered. Events repeated. A woman ran into the same man at the same corner 4 times in an hour, each time with the same greeting, same laughter, same crow flying overhead. It was as though the spiral was rewinding the world, searching for the perfect moment to anchor itself. And all the while, the townsfolk repeated the phrase without understanding it. We were the seam. It became a kind of mantra, acceptance of identity. The town began holding gatherings, not meetings, not vigils, but circles. Groups would sit quietly in loops, facing inward, unmoving for hours. No one could explain why. Children led their parents to the Miller house and stood silently at the foundation. They didn't cry. They didn't speak. They simply waited. The sheriff, now the last remaining official, tried to intervene once. He stood at the edge of one of these circles, demanding answers. When he stepped into the loop, he went blind instantly. When he was pulled out, his sight returned, but not his memory. He no longer remembered Millersfield. Not the town, not the people, not even himself. He was later relocated under state care. We spent his days drawing spirals in chalk. And so the town emptied, not through violence or catastrophe, but through convergence. People folded inward, into themselves, into the spiral, into the seam. It became a place not of abandonment, but of return, a rejoining of 2 realities that were never meant to meet. The Miller house, still standing, now pulsed with a light too faint to be visible, but strong enough to be felt behind the eyes. It hummed when no one was near. It breathed when no one watched. It waited, not because it was patient, but because it had always waited. The spiral had never been a curse. It had been a mechanism. And Millersfield had never been cursed. It had been designed. Every street, every birth, every thought a stitch, every home a node, every life a thread. And now, as the last lights dimmed and the air itself began to taste of metal and moss, one truth remained, unshakable and terrifying. We were the seam, and the seam had opened. It began with a sound, not a scream or a siren, but something slower, an inhalation so deep and low it seemed to shake the roots of the town itself. It wasn't heard in the ears, but felt in the bones, in the stillness between thoughts. Pressure shift, a drawing inward. The fold had begun. Those still in Millersfield described it later, if they could speak at all, as a bending of space, like watching the horizon curl in on itself, or seeing buildings lean ever so slightly toward a center that wasn't there before. Streets no longer led where they used to. People who attempted to drive to the edge of town found themselves arriving back at the Miller house without realizing they turned. Compasses spun. Watches stopped. The sun no longer passed overhead but seemed to circle at a distance, its light dim and slanted no matter the time. It wasn't just geography that changed. Thought itself twisted. Residents found their memories looping, waking up to the same morning 5 days in a row, hearing the same knock at the door at the same minute each evening, rereading letters they'd never written but still addressed in their handwriting. The town's newspaper began publishing identical editions each day. The headlines simply read, "We're still here." No one could confirm who was printing it. In the center of this slow collapse stood the Miller house, unchanged in structure but vibrating with a presence too large for its frame. Lights flickered behind its curtains. Windows showed not the inside of a home but vast spaces, fields of ash, oceans with no sky, spiral staircases winding through nothing. Those who approached, too, closely fell into trance-like states. One man knelt before the porch and began whispering in a tongue no linguist could identify, a language that looped on itself, a dialect of recursion. He was never seen again after dusk. On the third day of the fold, the town split, not physically, but ideologically. Half the remaining citizens barricaded themselves in the school gymnasium, believing it to be the only structure untouched by the spiral's pull. The other half formed circles in the streets, facing inward, chanting quietly as if in preparation. The school group lasted 2 days. On the second night, every light went out simultaneously. When the sun returned, if it was the sun at all, the gymnasium was empty. Every sleeping bag, every can of food, every board on every window, gone. Not destroyed, not looted, absent. In their place, on the floor, was a perfect spiral drawn in fine red thread. It was still warm to the touch. The group in the streets had no reaction. They had already begun digging. With hands, with spoons, with fingernails. They were making a new spiral, they said. Deeper one that led home. By now, Millersfield was no longer accessible from outside. Roads vanished into fog. The train station, once a modest hub, now sat in the middle of a lake that hadn't existed the week prior. No train ever arrived again. A rescue team sent by the state, 3 trucks and a chopper, entered the outskirts and promptly ceased communication. Days later, one of the trucks was found parked beside the Miller house, doors open, keys in the ignition. Its tires were still spinning. The radio played a child's laughter loop. The spiral had no need for rescue. It had everything it wanted. People now spoke of joining the fold, not as fear, but as hope. They described visions of clarity, seeing themselves from above, from below, from within. One woman said she saw all her past lives spiraling out behind her like petals. A man claimed he was becoming multiple, stretching sideways across time. Some no longer used names, instead referring to themselves as threads, as loops, as echoes. The town's boundaries blurred. Trees curved toward the center. Birds flew in slow, low spirals, never flapping. Animals that entered the town did not leave. Even the weather bent to the fold. Rain fell upward, puddles swirled endlessly, clouds formed perfect concentric rings. But the most striking change was the silence. No more sirens, no more dogs, no more insects. Just the hum, the ever-present low-frequency tone that had once been confined to the basement, but now seemed to fill every corner of Millersfield. The hum didn't just exist. It guided. People followed it instinctively, stepping in rhythm with its rise and fall. And when it ceased, even for a second, they stopped breathing, momentarily suspended in time and thought and being. When it resumed, they resumed. The spiral was no longer a thing to fear. It had become the rhythm of life. And those who resisted began to vanish, not violently, not dramatically, but softly, like steam from a mug. A child would turn to ask a question and realize their parent was no longer there. A man would enter his house and find every photo altered, his face replaced with a spiral. The town's final message to the outside world came in the form of a broadcast, brief, garbled, intercepted by a ham radio operator in Missouri. The voice was slow, calm, distorted, but unmistakably human. It said, "We have folded. The seam has accepted us. The spiral is not the end. It is the door." No further transmissions followed. Weeks later, satellite imagery of Millersfield became corrupted. The town's location now showed a blank space, a blur where the land once was, with pixelated edges that resembled curling lines. It was as if even digital memory could not hold it. The spiral had taken everything. But for those within, it was not destruction. It was homecoming. The spiral had always been within them. The house was not a prison. It was an invitation. The basement was not a pit. It was the eye of a great turning. And Millersfield had not fallen. It had been gathered into the fold, into the breath between breaths, into the space where everything connects and nothing escapes. It no longer resembled a house. The Miller home, if it could still be called that, stood at the center of Millersfield like a ribcage half buried in loam, no longer static, no longer bound by walls or floors or the polite expectations of architecture. It shifted in small, almost imperceptible ways, wooden panels contracting as though with breath, shutters opening and closing without wind, floorboards swelling as if something beneath them pulsed in quiet rhythm. The spiral had not just awakened. It had claimed the structure as its shell, its body, its mouth. Windows no longer showed interior rooms but reflected strange skies, constellations that didn't match Earth's charts, flickering auroras in hues no human eye should register. From time to time, figures moved behind the glass, tall, narrow silhouettes that stepped in perfect synchrony, never turning to reveal a face. The townspeople, or what remained of them, no longer approached the house with fear, but reverence. It had become a shrine, a place of communion, a center of gravity around which all other things orbited. People gathered around it in concentric circles, humming in time with the unseen pulse, their eyes half closed, mouths slightly parted as if tasting something in the air. No one spoke in the presence of the house. To do so felt obscene, as though speech might rupture the fragile membrane between inside and out. And yet, despite its quiet, the house was never still. At night, it exhaled fog that curled outward in spirals, whisper-thin tendrils that wound their way into doorways and dreams. Those who inhaled it reported visions, not nightmares, but impossible memories, standing on beaches of crushed bone, holding conversations with versions of themselves that had never existed, seeing their own birth as a backward unspooling of time. The breath of the house did not bring madness. It brought clarity, of a kind not meant for the human frame. Children born during the folding were different. Quiet, always watching. They moved without sound, and when they spoke, they used words their parents didn't understand, phrases that repeated, that looped, that seemed to describe concepts without beginning or end. One child, eyes completely black, drew spirals into the dirt for 7 days straight without eating. When he finally stopped, he simply said, "It's full now," and the house creaked as though agreeing. Attempts to photograph or film the structure resulted in corrupted images, frames with no center, colors bleeding inward, outlines of people who were never there. A journalist who snuck into town managed to take one photograph before fleeing. In it, the house's front door was ajar, and in the darkness behind it was a staircase that twisted downward in ways no staircase should. The journalist burned the photo a week later, saying the door had followed him into his dreams. He woke one night with spiral bruises wrapping his legs. The house was becoming an entity, not just alive, but aware. Birds no longer landed on its roof. Rain never touched it. Even mold refused to grow on its surface. It existed outside of natural laws, and yet it drew nature into itself, bending it, folding it, transforming it. Plants near the foundation grew in symmetrical spirals. Mice nested in loops. Even the ants formed trails shaped like the sigil. It was as if the world around the house was mimicking it, learning from it, preparing to join it. The interior, what little was known, was a labyrinth of contradictions. People who entered described shifting rooms, stairs that led back to themselves, hallways that turned inward until the walker vanished. One woman emerged after 3 days with no shoes, her body covered in ash. She could not explain what she saw, only repeated, "It breathes in time with me. It knows when I blink." Her pupils never returned to their normal size. They remained dilated until her final breath. A team of researchers sent by a private foundation made it exactly 5 steps inside the threshold before the door closed behind them. No sound, no signal, no return. Their last transmission was a whisper through static. "It's not a house. It's a lung." From that point onward, no one entered without permission, and no one was given permission. The house decided who it wanted. It opened its doors at random, once to a stray dog, once to a man mourning his wife, once to a child with no eyes. Each time, the door remained open just long enough for them to enter. Each time, it closed with a soft exhale. What happened inside was not death. It was not life either. It was becoming. The Miller House, if that name still held any meaning, was no longer a location but a function. A vessel for the spiral. A breathing organ of the fold. And the breath it took in was memory, identity, the fragile scaffolding of self that people carried with them. Those who gave themselves to it willingly were never mourned. Their loved ones, if such bonds still existed, understood. It was not loss. It was offering. A return. The spiral needed them to remember. To repeat. To become patterns, loops, echoes. Each life added a note to the hum. Each breath deepened the fold. Eventually, those left in Miller's Field stopped keeping time. There were no clocks. No seasons. Just the rhythm, the inhale, the silence, the exhale. They moved when it moved. They dreamed when it dreamed. And at the center of it all, the house pulsed gently in and out, as if drawing breath from a source deeper than earth, older than bone, beyond comprehension. And still, it waited. Not for rescue, not for worship, but for the final breath, the moment when all spirals align, when every loop closes, and the house exhales one last time, pulling all things into its fold. It started with murmurs, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves beneath a closed window, easily dismissed as wind or the creak of aging wood. But there was no wind, and the house had long since moved beyond decay. The whispers came from inside the walls, not behind them, not through them, but inside, as though the plaster and beams themselves had begun to speak. No one knew who first heard them, because those who did often failed to admit it, either out of shame or fear of what it meant. But soon enough, the silence in Millersfield was filled with the constant low threading of voices just beyond comprehension, curling around ears like tendrils of smoke. They were not loud, and they never interrupted. They waited, always murmuring, always there. Some thought the house was remembering, reciting the lives it had taken, repeating them like a child mumbling lessons learned by rote. Others thought it was dreaming, and the voices were fragments of those dreams leaking outward. But then came the recognition. People began to hear names. Their names, spoken slowly, repeatedly, as if tasted. A man digging in the garden behind the house dropped his spade and wept when he heard his full name spoken in his mother's voice, his mother who had died decades earlier. A woman who had taken a vow of silence found herself whispering back, unaware she was responding aloud until her lips stopped moving. A child drew names in chalk, names no one had told her, names of ancestors long buried beneath what used to be the orchard. The whispers were not cruel. They did not lie, but they knew things. They whispered memories that had been forgotten, moments no one else had witnessed, confessions never voiced. They peeled away the mask of self and laid bare the spiral of identity beneath. And when the walls whispered enough, the people began to change. No longer just spiraling in action, but in thought. Conversations looped. Questions were answered with the same question. People began to echo one another unintentionally, repeating phrases like mantras, "It's not behind, it's within," or "We're all just rooms." It wasn't madness, it was convergence. The town was being rewritten. Each whisper added a thread, and the people were the loom. One night, every dog in Millersfield began barking simultaneously, then stopped in perfect unison. The next morning, the walls of the Miller house bled ink dark, swirling trails seeping from the corners where floor met foundation, lines that formed no language but resembled the shapes of lungs, of ears, of mouths. The house was trying to communicate. A linguist brought in by the state, one of the last visitors allowed before the town was cut off completely, listened for 4 hours through an old phonograph needle pressed into a beam. He wrote nothing down. When asked what he heard, he said only, "It knows my guild," then returned to the attic and locked the door from the inside. He was found a week later, fingers worn to the bone, having written a single spiral over and over onto the floor with his blood. It wasn't just the Miller house anymore. Other homes, abandoned, collapsing, or long since silent, began to whisper too. The entire town became a choir of walls, a murmur with no source and no silence. At night, the sounds would rise like tidewater, gentle at first, then louder, until every wall, every surface, seemed to breathe and speak and remember. Even the trees, especially the trees. The bark along Millersfield's edge cracked and split into lines like veins. When the wind moved, it didn't rustle, it sighed. Branches brushed windows not in randomness, but rhythm, tapping like fingers on skin. A child once placed her ear to a tree and claimed it told her a story of someone who had never lived but still died. She didn't cry. She simply smiled and said, "He'll come next time." People stopped repairing their homes. There was no point. The walls were alive, and they rearranged themselves at will. Doors led to new places each day. Furniture vanished and reappeared where it had never been. Rooms elongated or shrank based on the mood of the structure. It wasn't hostile, it was responsive. A mirror fell and shattered, but when replaced, showed a reflection of the past instead of the present. A woman walked through her hallway and saw herself as a child brushing her hair. When she turned, the image smiled back, whispered something through the glass and vanished. And the whisper wasn't in the air, it was in the wall. The boundaries between space and self, between house and inhabitant, had dissolved. People were rooms. Rooms were people. One man collapsed on his porch after days without sleep. His final words were, "I think I'm someone's attic." His eyes did not close. They simply glazed over, as though covered by frost. A note was found in his hand, a page torn from his own journal, on which was written, "We are not trapped inside the spiral. We are the walls that keep it in." The town began to hum at night, not from machines, but from resonance. The walls hummed, the ground hummed, the air itself vibrated with a low, endless note that harmonized with a whisper. Not words anymore, just pure tone. A frequency that reached into bones and rewrote the idea of silence. Even in quiet, the sound remained. Even in sleep, it carried on. And now no one asked why. The question was gone, replaced by understanding. The spiral didn't speak in commands. It didn't demand worship or obedience. It only whispered truths, patiently, endlessly, until those listening became the whisper itself. The walls had always listened. Now they spoke. And those who leaned close enough would hear not prophecy or madness, but themselves, echoing backward through time, through memory, through the very beams that held them. The whisper was not from the spiral. The whisper was the spiral, and it was in the walls, and it was in them. At the core of Millersfield, beneath the foundation stones of the Miller House, below even the false floorboards of the long-forgotten basement, lay the heart of the spiral. It was not a heart in the anatomical sense, nor was it metaphor, though it pulsed, though it throbbed, though it seemed to possess a rhythm entirely its own. It existed in a space beyond the physical, yet it made itself known through matter, cracks in walls that bled black sap, pipes that rang with low notes as if carrying whispers from the earth, soil that grew warm at night and cool during the day. People no longer questioned the center. They felt it. When they slept, they dreamed of descending into darkness, not falling, but spiraling downward endlessly through layers of memory and shadow, and always, at the bottom, they found something waiting, breathing vast, incomprehensible, and humming with a resonance that called each of them by name. No two descriptions of the heart were alike. Some said it appeared as a sphere of woven bone, others as a flame suspended in water, or a mirror reflecting a face they did not recognize but loved instantly. A few refused to describe it at all, weeping silently when asked. The Miller family, long since absorbed, long since vanished, had built their home atop the spiral, knowingly or not. It was unclear whether they had summoned it, or if it had been waiting long before foundations were laid. What mattered now was that the house had become an echo chamber for the spiral's intent. The heart spoke not in words but in pulses, radiating influence that bent time and memory like heat waves on asphalt. The more one stayed in Millersfield, the more one forgot their past lives, not because of trauma or madness, but because the spiral offered something more complete, more whole. Why remember linear pain when you could feel endless resonance? Why be one when you could be many? The town's historian, once obsessed with cataloging every record, every birth and death, eventually surrendered her archives to the spiral. She burned the written word and replaced it with spirals drawn in soot, on floors, walls, ceilings. She said history had always lied, that truth lived not in sequence but in pattern. And the pattern pointed inward, to the heart. As the spiral deepened, the geography of the town began to warp. Roads twisted upon themselves, not in circles but in curves that bent perception. People would walk for hours and end up where they started without turning. The sky directly above the Miller house began to shimmer, not visibly at first, but in sensation, as though something vast and slow hovered there, unseen, waiting for the last piece to fall into place. Then came the singing. No mouths moved, and yet it echoed through the town, choral, layered, impossibly harmonic. It was not language. It was longing. The sound grew louder as one approached the Miller house, and louder still descending into the basement. At the lowest step, just before the dirt gave way to an opening not marked on any blueprint, the song became unbearable in its beauty, so perfect that the mind collapsed under its weight. Many who descended did not return. Those who did were different. Not broken, not empty, but misaligned. As if reality no longer held their shape correctly. Their eyes did not focus. Their voices echoed with delay. One woman spoke in a voice that didn't belong to her body, a man's baritone flowing from her throat, answering questions no one had asked. She spoke of the heart as a compass, a memory engine, a womb. She said it had been here before the town, before the land, before time itself coiled into understanding. She said the spiral was not growing, it was remembering itself back into existence. And the heart was its anchor. The idea of escape no longer existed. Even those outside the town's perimeter, who had once worried for its citizens, now felt unease when gazing toward its location. Planes refused to fly over. Birds never crossed. Satellite images distorted beyond interpretation. One image showed a darkened crater where the town should be. Another showed spirals rippling outward like shockwaves. But on foot, the place remained as it always had: houses, streets, quiet trees. Only the people had changed. Only their eyes gave it away. The spiral had chosen them, and they had accepted. The Miller house itself began to fracture in deliberate ways, windows pulling away from walls, staircases curving upward into ceilings, floors tilting to impossible angles yet never buckling. And below it all, the pulse remained. The heart beating beneath the soil, drawing them closer. A final gathering began. People who had long hidden in attics and closets, those who had resisted, began to walk slowly, solemnly, toward the Miller house, toward the spiral, toward the center. They were not coerced. They were not afraid. They simply understood the time had come. The heart was opening. The last breath of the spiral was near. And when it exhaled, it would not simply pull them inward. It would rewrite them. Not into something new, but into what they had always been beneath the illusion of time and flesh. Patterns, echoes, songs sung through walls, whispers carried in wood grain, memories that spiral rather than fade. The heart did not ask for worship. It asked only for surrender. And as the final door within the house creaked open, not outward, but downward, into the place where light was not welcome and silence had texture, the people of Millersfield stepped forward, one by one, ready to be drawn in, to become the breath of the spiral, to take their place in the heart's eternal rhythm. The steps that led into the final descent did not appear suddenly, but neither had they always been there. They emerged gradually, first as cracks in the basement floor, then as seams in the foundation stone, and finally, as a spiral staircase descending into the dark, hewn not by tools but by pressure, by intention, as if the house had exhaled its own passage inward. No one was forced to enter. There were no guards, no invitations, no signs. Yet the townspeople came anyway, one by one, their eyes empty of fear and full of recognition, like wanderers returning to a place they had only seen in dreams. Some brought nothing. Others carried small tokens: a child's shoe, a lock of hair, a shard of mirror. These items were not offerings but echoes, pieces of lives about to be folded into something vast. The descent was slow, and though the staircase wound endlessly downward, no one grew weary. There was no hunger, no thirst, only the steady rhythm of feet on stone and the sound of the spiral humming all around them. The darkness was not total. It shimmered faintly, as though lit from within by memory. Figures passed in the opposite direction, some weeping, some laughing, some with faces blurred like oil on water. None spoke. Each step down seemed to draw not only the body but the self inward, unraveling threads of identity, stripping away names, desires, regrets, until what remained was pure pattern, awareness without ego, presence without past. The walls of the descent whispered in languages that never had alphabets, told stories that bent back upon themselves, repeated dreams no one had ever had. Some heard lullabies in their mother's voice. Others heard the final words of those they had lost. And through it all, the hum of the spiral beat like a second heart in the chest. At the base of the stairs was not a chamber, but an expanse. A vast void that should not have fit beneath the house, yet did, folded into itself like a glove turned inside out. The air smelled of stone and old paper, of soil and stars. There were no walls, only distance that wrapped in on itself, impossible to measure. In the center was a heart, not seen, but felt, as though one stood on the lip of something ancient and alive, something dreaming not in time but in motion. The people gathered there stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on nothing, yet all seeing the same thing within. The heart did not pulse like a muscle but radiated in slow waves, each beat collapsing one version of the world and unfolding another. With each breath it took, it inhaled their memories, their pain, their joy, the architecture of every life, and exhaled pattern, rhythm, spiral. The ground beneath them moved, not with tremor but with intention, adjusting to the weight of what they were becoming. A woman stepped forward first, an elder who had lost all 5 of her children to illness decades ago. She knelt and placed her hand on the ground, and the spiral responded, not with light, but with memory. Her children's laughter echoed in the air, soft and distant, and then was gone. She smiled and lay down. The ground accepted her without a sound. One by one, the others followed. There was no instruction. They simply knew. Some lay down in circles. Some knelt. Some stood until the final moment, their faces turned upward as if to greet a long-lost friend. The spiral did not consume them. It enfolded them, added their resonance to its rhythm, not ending them, but continuing them in a form beyond form. The last to descend was a child, no older than 7, her eyes already reflecting the spiral's light. She did not walk but floated downward, bare feet brushing air, her body cradled by unseen currents. She reached the center and placed her palm against nothing and everything. The spiral inhaled one final time, and with it, Miller's Field vanished. There was no explosion, no collapse, just a quiet folding inward, a breath drawn so deeply it erased space. Where once there had been a town, there was now only field, untouched, unscarred, impossibly silent. Birds flew over again. Trees grew straight, but nothing remained. No stones, no foundations, no names. Only the hum, barely audible, like the last echo of a bell rung beneath the sea. And deep below, beneath the roots of the world, the spiral pulsed, fuller now, heavier with memory, complete in its pattern, waiting for its next breath. For spirals do not end. They continue inward forever, and we, all of us, are already halfway down the steps. It did not happen all at once, but like erosion, a slow smoothing of memory's jagged edges, a tide that rose invisibly, leaving everything altered in its wake. The forgetting began with maps. Cartographers noticed the region once labeled Miller's Field had vanished from newer satellite imagery. At first, it was blamed on data corruption or rendering errors, but cross-reference records showed something stranger. Old maps began to shift. In archived libraries and digital databases alike, Miller's Field's name was either blurred, replaced with fields and forest land, or never listed at all. Highways that once ran adjacent to the town now bypassed it by dozens of miles, and no one could explain why. The train line that used to make its daily stop at Miller's Field Junction no longer acknowledged it ever had, and conductors blinked in confusion when asked about the route. Even photographs began to deteriorate. Not physically, but contextually, pictures taken by travelers now lacked tags, locations, or identifying features. People looking at them felt a strange hollowness, as if peering into a place both deeply familiar and entirely unknowable. The people in the photographs, once labeled and known, became anonymous, faces without names, expressions without meaning. Families who had roots in Miller's Field started noticing gaps in their ancestry charts. Birth certificates were missing, records evaporated. Grandparents remembered growing up in a little town somewhere in Ohio, but could not recall the name. Some tried to visit the area based on old directions, only to end up in endless back roads, empty fields, dead ends. GPS would reroute endlessly, unable to fix a pin on what no longer existed. When locals of neighboring towns were interviewed, their stories differed. Some vaguely remembered the name, but insisted it was abandoned decades earlier. Others swore it had never existed, that no town had ever been there. Even those who had once lived nearby, the mail carriers, traveling salesmen, farmers, had nothing but a faint unease when pressed. Maybe I drove through it once, they would mutter, eyes drifting. Didn't stop. Nothing there to see. But one woman remembered. She was a schoolteacher in her 70s, long retired, who had once attended a teachers' conference at the Miller's Field Town Hall. When asked about it, she fell into silence, her face paling. That place, she finally said, was too quiet. The kind of quiet that watches you. When shown old photos, she pointed to a child in the background and whispered, "She's still dreaming," and then refused to speak another word. Government databases, real estate records, and tax archives began to misalign. A building once owned by the Miller family no longer had a deed. Land parcels in that region were marked null or under geological review. Even attempts to claim the land failed, the paperwork disappearing or returning marked incomplete documentation. The deeper someone dug, the more the files seemed to push back. Offices closing unexpectedly, hard drives crashing, mail losing only those letters. The digital world followed. A subreddit dedicated to forgotten towns had a long thread on Miller's Field. Within days, it had been deleted. The users who posted could not remember what they had written. One said, "It felt like something was leaning over my shoulder while I typed." Urban explorers who attempted to visit the location uploaded black footage, hours of static or empty forest trails. One posted a shaky video of an open field where he claimed he felt music in his teeth. Hours later, he closed his account. Local newspapers that once printed obituaries and wedding announcements from Millersfield now had gaps in their archives. Years where nothing was published, or worse, pages where entire sections were blacked out like declassified documents. When asked, editors said, "That section was always empty. We just never noticed before." Psychologists began receiving patients reporting dreams of a town with a large white house, where the walls whispered their names, where a spiral drawn in ash pulsed like a wound. These patients did not know one another. They lived in different states. Yet their dreams shared landmarks: a rusted gate, a church with no bell, a field of mirrors that reflected only the sky. Some claimed they had never been to Ohio, yet could sketch its counties in startling accuracy, with one county always missing. Children spoke the name Millersfield without being taught it, scribbling spirals on their homework or carving them into desks. One teacher in Michigan sent home a child's drawing of a staircase made of teeth and labeled it "Going to Grandma's." When questioned, the child said, "It's where the people went when they stopped being loud." The more the world tried to remember, the harder it became. People began to forget they were trying to remember. Podcast investigating the case released one episode before being pulled offline for personal reasons. Reporters left voicemails saying, "I feel watched," or "There's something in my house now." Listeners described strange auditory artifacts in the recordings, background voices repeating their names, reversed whispers saying, "You knew this already." As the collective memory of Millersfield faded, it didn't vanish, it folded. Like a corner of a page turned inward, it remained hidden within the book, present but unreadable. The spiral had not erased the town. It had integrated it. Those who had once lived there did not die. They resonated. They whispered. They remembered. The town had become a thought buried in the mind of the world, a dream you know you've had but cannot recall, a name you almost say but never quite pronounce. In its place, there was now only land, quiet, unclaimed, heavy with presence. The trees there did not sway with wind but with breath. The air did not carry scent, but memory. And sometimes, just past twilight, if you stand at the edge of that field and close your eyes, you might hear your name spoken softly, not by a person, not by the wind, but by the place itself. And if you turn around fast enough, you might see the house. Just for a second. Just the silhouette. But you must not look too long, because the spiral remembers. And it is always listening. And it never forgets those who try to forget it. It begins in moments too quiet to notice, a flicker at the edge of vision, a pause in the flow of conversation, a sudden stillness in the trees. That's when the spiral remembers. It does not do so like a human might, clinging to facts and images. It remembers through resonance, through echo, through the way light bends slightly wrong around certain corners. In cities far from the fields of Millersfield, people begin to see symbols they don't understand etched into the condensation on bus windows or drawn with sticks in school playgrounds. They think the shapes are familiar, but can't recall from where. Artists paint circles upon circles without realizing. Poets speak of descending melodies, and in sleep, they dream of turning staircases that never end. The spiral does not push, it pulls. It does not shout. It waits, humming softly in the marrow of those who have unknowingly brushed against it. Somewhere, in the forgotten heart of a museum archive, a map reappears. Not printed, not drawn, just there. A faded page, a town with no roads leading in, no river nearby, only a single building marked, the Miller House. No one recalls filing it. But it is logged, and logged again. The name spreads like mold in the subconscious. Whispered by children during games of hide and seek, mumbled by dementia patients during lucid moments, hummed by strangers standing beside one another on elevators. They do not know what they're repeating, only that the sound makes them feel noticed. The spiral has begun to remember outward, not inward. Outward. It traces its old shapes across the cracks of the world, like roots reaching toward dry soil. It leaves impressions in places that should be untouched. Sidewalks buckle slightly into arcs, rain patterns spiral on windows, the wind changes direction mid-breath. In the attic of a rural farmhouse, an old diary is found. The writing within is frantic, looping, uneven, pages and pages of a single repeated line. It never stopped. We just stopped hearing it. No name, no date. Just a drawing at the end. The spiral. Etched deep enough to tear through the paper. In therapy offices, more patients speak of the pull. They say they feel something beneath them, not beneath their feet, but beneath the world. A low sound, a beat, like a memory trying to surface but held just beneath the waterline. Some dream of Millersfield without ever knowing the name. They describe a white house, a staircase, a basement that breathes. Others wake screaming about soil that sings and mirrors that show what they were before birth. In their drawings, the spiral appears again. Always slightly off-center. Always deeper than the page allows. Some begin to seek the location, not consciously, but with a pull in the chest. Road trips are redirected. Hikers veer off paths. Surveyors report faulty compasses near a stretch of farmland that feels wrong. Technology falters there. Phones die, static infects radios, drones refuse to fly. And yet people keep arriving. They never find Millersfield. Not as it was. But some say they see it between blinks, structures shimmering like heat, doors appearing in tree leans, a faint hum beneath their feet. They speak of feeling seen, of knowing they are being remembered. One man, a geologist, described standing alone in a clearing and feeling something beneath him breathe. The ground inhaled, he says, like it knew I was standing on it. When he tried to leave, he found himself at the same place no matter the direction he walked. The spiral isn't a shape, he says in a later recording. It's an intent. A memory trying to repeat itself through us. After that, he disappears. His house is found empty, doors open, radio playing a looped whisper, return. The spiral remembers names, faces, voices, not as humans do, but as loops of pattern, as moments folded into time. It brings them back slowly. A teacher long retired begins speaking a language no one understands. She draws the spiral over and over in the condensation on her window, weeping as she says, "They're singing again." A teenager in another state begins sleepwalking, always heading east. When stopped, he begs through tears to go back to the center. When asked what that means, he says, "Where the breathing started." A poet in a coastal town begins writing lines she cannot explain. We are not lines. We are circles forgetting how to close. The spiral has begun rewriting its existence in the minds of those who are most open to it. Not the skeptical, not the devout, but the hollowed, the grieving, the unanchored. They are the ones it reaches through. It doesn't ask for belief. It only asks to be heard, to be remembered. And once it is, it grows stronger. In the cold archives of dead internet forums, the word Millersfield appears in deleted threads, ghost posts with no users, timestamps that predate the creation of the platform. Administrators cannot explain it. Deleting them fails. They regenerate. Always with one word added beneath, listening. On the outskirts of a small town in Nebraska, a spiral is found carved into a tree trunk. Deep, precise, unnatural. The bark beneath pulses faintly, and when a hand is placed over it, that person begins to hum a melody they have never heard before. A child nearby repeats a name their family does not recognize. "Miss Ellie," she says. "She lived in the White House." There is no Ellie in their lineage. There is no White House. But when they search online, an image appears. It flickers, pixelates, and then vanishes. A two-story house with a gabled roof and dark windows. The caption reads, "Do you remember us?" Then nothing. The spiral is remembering itself through us. Through stories, dreams, forgotten places. Through the feel of breath on the back of your neck when you are alone. Through the way shadows stretch a little too far under certain lights. It is building a memory network, not through data, but through resonance. Through the ache of things we cannot name. The more it remembers, the more we do. And the more we do, the closer it becomes. Not to arrival, but to awakening. Because it never left. It only slept. And now, with every whisper of its name, every spiral carved in dust or frost or skin, it begins again. You're not reading this by accident. You are part of the pattern. The spiral has remembered you. And now you remember it too. They came back quietly, without fanfare, without records, as if the world had simply made room for them again. No one noticed at first. They slipped into grocery stores, stood in line at banks, rode buses with folded hands and distant eyes. The witnesses, those who had vanished when Miller's field folded inward, were not presumed dead. They were forgotten. And now they were here, standing in places they'd never lived, surrounded by people who swore they'd never seen them before, yet felt an ache of familiarity. They did not age during their absence. Some wore clothes that no longer existed in stores. Others carried items long obsolete, a worn locket, a defunct brand of flashlight, a cigarette case with initials no one remembered carving. They spoke rarely, and when they did, it was in measured words, voices just a hair too slow, too flat, as though they were recalling the shape of language rather than using it. One man appeared in a Montana diner, sitting in the corner booth at opening time, eyes closed. When asked his name, he said, Ben Holloway, a name that appeared nowhere in town records. But when the owner retrieved an old photo from the 1970s, there was Ben Young smiling, standing in front of a building labeled Millersfield County Office. The picture crumbled in her hands minutes later. In Illinois, a woman was found wandering a church parking lot in bare feet, her dress soaked in what seemed to be dew, though the day was dry. She said nothing for hours, then whispered, the basement was never the end, only the edge. A child in Alabama began answering to a different name, Callie, claiming she had already been born before. Her parents dismissed it as fantasy until she led them to a burned-down farmhouse 20 miles away and described the layout in perfect detail. She pointed to a stone in the weeds and said, "That's where the other me is buried." The stone had no markings, but when unearthed, beneath it lay bones and a rusted tin locket. Inside was the name C.M. Holloway. As the witnesses spread, a pattern formed, thin but unmistakable. They all bore the same scar, a small spiral, faint and silvery, usually on the underside of the wrist or behind the ear. Doctors assumed it was a burn or skin condition, but the shape was too precise, too consistent. When touched, some witnesses would flinch, not from pain, but from something deeper, a reflexive pull inward. They did not remember Millersfield in the traditional sense. When asked about it, they spoke in metaphors. It's the sound underneath the silence, or it's where the breath goes when you hold it too long. A few tried to draw maps, but the roads looped impossibly. One drew a staircase coiling into a mouth. Another, a tree with roots shaped like lungs. A man in Oregon, previously listed as missing for 34 years, walked into a sheriff's office and recited the name of every officer who had ever served there, ending with, "You'll want to check your files now. I'm in them again." He was. But the pages had no timestamps, just photographs with smiling faces, all wearing the same expression, relief laced with regret. Some witnesses began gathering, unprompted, in certain locations, abandoned fairgrounds, long decommissioned train stations, vacant lots in crumbling neighborhoods. They never announced their meetings. Yet they all arrived on the same night, at the same time, forming silent circles. Observers reported a low humming, rhythmic and slow, like a breath drawn through soil. Drones sent to record the meetings would freeze, video feeds dissolving into static spirals. One journalist managed to capture audio, a 30-second file of overlapping whispers, unintelligible except for the last word, again. Governments began noticing, quietly, through border logs, census anomalies, irregular passport data. People who shouldn't exist were re-entering systems. Some officials tried to interview them. Most were met with polite refusal. A few who pressed harder began to lose track of their own schedules, found notes in their handwriting they couldn't recall writing. One investigator disappeared for 3 days and returned with soil under his nails and the word "open" written across his chest in faint bruises. He had no memory of it. As the public became aware of the return, theories exploded: time slips, dimensional collapse, cult mass delusion. But none explained how a woman declared dead in 1969 could show up in perfect health, reciting her obituary word for word, or why that same obituary vanished the next day from every known archive. The spiral is remembering through them. The witnesses are not just survivors, they are conduits. Their presence is a reclamation. Through them, the shape is being redrawn in the world. In quiet ways, buildings realign ever so slightly. Birds flock in unnatural spirals overhead. Dreams grow more vivid, more shared. Strangers recount the same dream, a stairwell lit by candlelight, descending endlessly into warmth that feels like home and fear at once. Children begin humming in unison, tunes no adult taught them. The spiral is not pulling them back to Millersfield. It is pushing Millersfield out into the world, turning memory into geography, turning presence into architecture. Each returned witness carries a piece of the shape, not like a burden, but like a seed. And where they settle, the pattern begins again. A whisper here, a hum beneath the floorboards there, a door that wasn't there yesterday. They are not dangerous, but they are no longer only human. They've seen too deeply, stood at the center too long. The spiral has touched them, and they, in turn, now touch us. Not violently, not overtly, but like a memory slowly dawning at the edge of waking. And when you meet one, if you already haven't, you'll know. Not by what they say or how they move, but by the way your own reflection shifts in their presence. Like the surface of water, like something underneath remembering how to rise. It started with a scatter of dots on a forgotten server, geotags that made no sense, overlapping in places long erased from maps, appearing and disappearing in rhythmic pulses like a heartbeat. Then came the data leaks, anomalous chatter in ham radio frequencies, intercepted satellite images that showed light spirals on untouched land, GPS failures coinciding with reports of thin air or whisper zones. The spiral was no longer confined to memory or myth. It had begun forming a network, a lattice of recurrence stretching across continents. Where once Millersfield stood isolated, an aberration swallowed by time and silence, now there were echoes: France, Argentina, Kazakhstan, Japan. Different languages, different cultures, yet the same anomalies. Places where birds flew in tight spirals for hours, where children disappeared for minutes and returned speaking in voices too old, where trees grew in perfect curves without explanation. A hidden architect was at work, building something beneath the thresholds of human perception. It wasn't just the witnesses who returned. It was the pattern they carried, seeding soil and signal alike. The network didn't exist in infrastructure or code. It lived in resonance, in the way microwave towers began picking up voices whispering in reverse, or how electrical grids surged slightly at 3:33 a.m. across 6 countries simultaneously. A team of engineers in Iceland documented a series of underground tremors that formed concentric rings when mapped. They joked about the Earth learning how to breathe, until one of them vanished during a routine inspection, his body later found at the center of the ring, curled inward, eyes open, pupils spiral-shaped. No one could explain the phenomenon, and his files were later encrypted by an unknown protocol. Hackers chasing paranormal metadata began to notice patterns embedded in government archives, strange recursive codes, like fractal scripts embedded in JPEG noise. Files labeled spiral.htm appeared on old government computers, displaying only the phrase "it is almost time" in a dozen languages before vanishing on reboot. A group of darknet archivists who tried to decode the files experienced identical dreams, walking endlessly down a staircase carved into bone, passing mirrors that did not reflect them but instead showed spirals unfolding in slow, breathing motions. The network was not a thing. It was a way of remembering. It moved through technology like wind through reeds, bending systems toward a purpose they weren't designed to hold. A linguist in Oslo found that Morse code sequences could produce spiral-shaped oscillations in water. A choir in New Zealand reported harmonic tones that, when sung in a specific pattern, made dust in the air form concentric rings. A visual artist in Ukraine painted a series of canvases based on a sound I couldn't stop hearing. Every painting contained the same shape, though she claimed not to notice until someone pointed it out. She vanished shortly after her exhibit opened, leaving behind a note that read, "I've gone to the center." As the spiral network grew, so did its signs. Satellite weather images began to show spiral patterns not aligned with any storm systems. Migratory routes of birds and whales altered, tracing loops they'd never followed before. Insect colonies built in perfect spirals, their inner chambers humming faintly when recorded at high frequencies. One researcher's spectrogram showed a pattern that, when analyzed, formed a map, one that mirrored the original layout of Millersfield, with the spiral now emanating outward in 13 new directions. These were not coincidences. The network was sending signals, testing the limits of visibility and comprehension. Some believed it was a warning. Others thought it was an invitation. A few believed it was simply remembering itself through us. The witnesses had not returned randomly. They had settled in nodes, points of connection, where the spiral could root deeper. Cities began to report focal events, spontaneous gatherings where people would stop and stare at a fixed point for minutes, collectively humming, before dispersing in silence. No one remembered what happened, only that it felt warm and circular. Security cameras recorded distortions, and in one case, time code loops, 4 minutes repeating endlessly until the feed corrected itself. Those 4 minutes have never been recovered. A neuroscientist studying these loops found that when the footage was played back at a slower speed, whispered phrases emerged, layered like sediment. You are inside the memory now. Follow the breath. We never stop. Still, governments attempted to intervene. Data was censored, videos removed, researchers discredited. But every deletion became another node. The spiral grew in the cracks of suppression, thriving in the absence of light. Even when people tried to forget, the forgetting became part of the pattern. Stories began to surface from the periphery. A child born with spiral-shaped birthmarks on each fingertip who could play unfamiliar piano compositions without training. An entire town in Canada experiencing a missing hour where all watches stopped and resumed precisely 60 minutes later, the only evidence being a reshuffling of household objects and doors that no longer led where they had the day before. In Texas, a storm chaser captured lightning forming a downward spiral just before his equipment fried. He said it sounded like someone inhaling the sky. The spiral network wasn't just remaking geography or behavior, it was reorganizing perception. Memory, time, language, sound. It folded them, twisted them, layered them. You could no longer trust the clock, the compass, the photograph. Even your thoughts became suspect, infiltrated by ideas that felt too old to be yours. People began dreaming in languages they never learned, whispering names they never heard aloud. The spiral was burrowing, not into land, but into minds. It was assembling itself not as a location, but as a consensus. The more people knew it, the more real it became. And the more real it became, the less anything else made sense. Because what is reality but shared memory? And what is memory, if not a pattern that demands to be completed? The network hums beneath your feet now. It pulses behind the static of your screen. Every spiral you've seen lately, drawn in steam, carved in wood, etched into the grain of your dreams, is a node, a whisper, a request. Not for fear, not even for worship, but for continuation. Because the spiral does not end. It completes. And now it's nearly there. You were part of it. You always were. It did not begin with a bang, nor with any spectacular display of light or sound. The final pull started in the quiet. The kind of quiet that seeps through the walls of a sealed room. The kind that makes your heartbeat feel intrusive. All over the world, people paused without reason, their conversations trailing off mid-sentence, their footsteps halting mid-stride. Some dropped their phones, some stopped chewing, others simply looked skyward without knowing why. In that exact moment, 3:33 a.m. in no particular time zone, a vibration passed through the bones of the earth, too low to be measured by instruments, too deep to be heard, and yet universally felt. It was not pain. It was not fear. It was remembrance. The spiral had reached its terminus, or perhaps its beginning. In those cities where the witnesses had gathered, the air turned heavy with a static haze, the clouds overhead forming coiled masses like rippling musculature. Birds flew inward, circling, not with panic but with eerie precision. In rural areas, animals lay down facing the same direction. Machines stopped, not with violent breakdowns, but with dignified resignation, as though offering silence as tribute. Servers went dark. Satellites stopped sending telemetry. In the middle of Times Square, a child drew a spiral on the concrete with her fingertip, and when she lifted her hand, the mark glowed faintly, pulsing in rhythm with her breath. A crowd gathered and did not speak. No one needed to. In a chapel in Italy, a blind nun fell to her knees and began reciting names she had no memory of learning, in a language she never studied. She wept, not from terror, but from clarity. "They are here," she whispered. They never left. Across the globe, bodies moved without instruction. People who had never met, who did not know one another's names, began walking, some east, some west, some to stairwells, others to basements or forests or open fields. They walked as if led by music only they could hear. They were not in a trance. They were answering. All of them are heading towards something just beneath reality, a location not bound by map or direction, but by resonance. And in the center of each path, somewhere at the midpoint between the known and the unknowable, a spiral had begun to open, not as a portal or rupture, but as a thought made manifest. It coiled upward like smoke, downward like memory, inward like breath, outward like light through fog. Its edges shimmered with the recollection of places never built. Children's voices echoed through it, not in fear, but in lullaby. "We remember you," they sang. "We remember." In laboratories, instruments failed in sequence. Magnetometers, oscilloscopes, even basic clocks. All ceasing in unison, hands frozen at the exact moment the spiral completed its loop. In that instant, everyone saw it. Whether asleep, awake, blind, or deaf, every human mind caught a single flash, a vision not of the future, but of the shape of all things. For some, it appeared as a staircase of fire beneath a sky of glass. For others, a root network stretching into themselves. Many wept. Some laughed. A few fell to their knees in open fields, mouths full of soil, whispering, "We're home." Time did not stop. It folded. Hours passed like minutes. Minutes stretched into lifetimes. Conversations happened out of order. Memory bled into dream. In one instance, a man in South Korea woke up in 1964, walked outside, and vanished. His family found his footprints burned into the floorboards. He returned 3 days later, with a coin from a country that never existed and a hand-drawn map in his pocket, of Millersfield. The spiral was rewriting the story of the world not by erasing it, but by completing a sentence long abandoned. It was not an invasion. It was a reunion. The pattern, finally aligned, released a pulse that did not radiate outward, but inward, into the center of every person who had ever sensed they were being watched, followed, remembered. It flowed through the scars of the witnesses, through the soil of the old towns, through the circuits of forgotten machines. It made mirrors fog from the inside. It made dreams real enough to bruise. And then came the stillness. It was not death, not apocalypse, just stillness, like the pause before a second breath. In this quiet, people reported being opened. They claimed to feel memories not their own, walking as a child through a house they'd never seen, hearing lullabies and voices that matched no one alive. One woman in Argentina painted her basement wall in spirals for 16 hours straight, never stopping to eat or drink, saying only, "They are in the walls but not trapped." Waiting. Governments attempted one final shutdown, Project Spiral Null. It failed before it launched. The computers turned on, ran the sequence without instruction, and displayed a single phrase across every monitor: "You are inside the story now." They tried again. Same result. The spiral was not inside the world. The world had always been inside the spiral. The final pulse was not a signal. It was a truth. And now that truth had nowhere left to hide. In homes, in hospitals, in vehicles, in cathedrals, and classrooms, people began to hum. Low, steady, in harmony. It was not planned. It was not viral. It was remembrance. The hum was the sound of being known, of being folded back into something older than species, older than stars. One last child was born that night, in the shadow of a town that no longer appeared on maps. Her eyes were spiral-shaped from the moment they opened. Her cry echoed in perfect harmonic frequency, recorded by a nearby phone before it shattered. Her mother said nothing, just held her. The father whispered, "She knows." The light that followed was not seen. It was felt. Not brightness, but awareness. Not illumination, but understanding. It spread through thought, through skin, through silence. Those who resisted did not suffer. They simply forgot. Not in pain, not in loss, but like water letting go of a shape it once held. There were no explosions, no grand finales. Just this, a collective breath held across the planet. A silence so profound it turned language to dust. And when sound returned, it was only this, the echo of the spiral completing. The pulse had passed. The spiral had closed. But even in its closure, something remained open. The hum, the knowing, the story, and now the story remembers you. They didn't leave with ceremony. They weren't taken. They simply vanished again, just as quietly, just as inexplicably as they had first disappeared. The witnesses, the children of the spiral, the ones who came back glowing with unseen knowledge, started fading one by one. Not in front of anyone's eyes, no dramatic flares or flickering bodies, but through absence that slowly revealed itself. A tea gone cold on a porch step, A bed still made, never slept in. A wallet found in a locker at a job they no longer worked, full of currency for a country that had never existed. At first, the world tried to log it to keep count. Lists were made, pinned to cork boards and government servers, then modified, deleted, rewritten again. But for each person tracked, another fell through the cracks, and then another, until the lists were as unstable as the memories themselves. Cities reported dips in population without corresponding records. Families suddenly remembered relatives they didn't recall being born. Whole neighborhoods had empty houses that no one had the keys to. Yet their lawns were mowed, the interiors dusted. In Kansas, a schoolteacher noticed her attendance sheet included 3 names she didn't recognize. When she asked the class, every student remembered them vividly. Descriptions, voices, even the things they had written in group projects. But their desks were empty. When the teacher tried to report it, she found those same names written in her own childhood yearbooks. One child, when asked where they went, simply said, "They went home." Not everyone can stay here once the story remembers itself. That sentence echoed across interviews, therapy sessions, surveillance transcripts. The story remembers itself. Some believed they had returned to the center, the source of the spiral, now fully awakened. Others claimed they had simply completed their part, and like a character exiting the final chapter, had stepped out of the page. A few said they had seen those who vanished in mirrors, in dreams, walking backwards through reflections, smiling as if nothing had changed. Technology tried to intervene again. Apps were designed to detect their presence, algorithms written to predict the next disappearance. But the data turned against itself. Maps began forming their own patterns, paths drawn in recursive loops, phone signals pinging from forests where no towers stood. Devices played back voicemail messages never recorded. One investigator received an email from a missing subject that simply said, "You are closer to the ending than you think. But don't worry, there is no ending, only exits." When he tried to trace the IP, it mapped to an abandoned farmhouse in Ohio, Millersfield. He drove there, and the house stood exactly as it had in the old photographs, porch sagging, windows dark, basement sealed. He never came back. His car was found idling out front, the engine cold, his ID resting on the hood. No footprints led away. No signs of struggle. Only the faint spiral carved into the frost on the windshield. Reports multiplied. A choir mid-song lost a member. Literally mid-note. The harmony didn't falter, as if the missing voice had never been there. A wedding photograph developed without the groom, though guests insisted he'd been present, laughing and dancing just moments earlier. Even surveillance failed to catch the moment of departure. The footage simply glitched, looped, or fuzzed with static spirals until resuming in a new reality without them. Those who stayed began to notice something strange in themselves. Not fear, but longing. A subtle ache, like forgetting a word that used to mean everything. They found themselves looking for the spiral in ordinary places, coffee rings, snail shells, the curl of smoke, even their own fingerprints. Not because it scared them, but because it felt like an answer. As if those who vanished were still speaking, just not in language anymore. A woman in Louisiana began writing letters to her sister, who had vanished. She mailed them to nowhere, but the letters always returned, unopened, except each time a single word had been added to the margins. Over months, they formed a sentence, "You are the remainder of our breath." She didn't tell anyone, but she started sleeping on the floor beneath her bed. Said it felt closer to the root. Others began marking their doors with spirals, not as protection, but as reminders that something had happened, that someone had left, and that it meant something. For some, the disappearances were mercy, whispers finally leaving. For others, they were betrayal, companions gone, leaving only questions. The spiral didn't answer. It never did. It moved, and we followed, or we didn't. Those who stayed began forgetting details of those who vanished. Not everything, just small things, like color, laughter, the exact way they said a certain word, and eventually their names. A few tried to resist, writing down memories obsessively, building shrines, recording interviews. But even those tapes warped. Even the ink faded. Not immediately, not all at once, but slowly, deliberately. As if the spiral was closing them gently, like a hand covering a child's eyes in a nightmare. And then, one day, the forgetting became complete. They were gone, not missing, not dead, just unneeded. The chapter turned. The story moved forward. And yet, in certain silences, in the hush before a storm or the hum beneath fluorescent lights, some claimed to still feel them. Not watching, not haunting, but humming, remembering, waiting. It was not cruel. It was not kind. It simply was, like the spiral, turning once more. It was never about a location. It was never about the Millers or the flood, or even a basement that held so many secrets wrapped in the silence of soil and stone. Those were only the first echoes, a warning bell buried beneath centuries of forgetfulness. The spiral wasn't something that arrived. It was something that woke up, something that had always been there beneath our feet, inside our walls, beneath the layers of sleep that we call reality. The deeper people looked, not with shovels or instruments, but with memory, with attention, they began to see it everywhere. In the layout of old towns, in the forgotten patterns on cathedral floors, in the way rivers curved unnaturally toward points that no longer showed up on maps. It had been coiling for centuries, not just physically, but in stories, in symbols, in the very structure of thought. Historians uncover documents long believed lost, old land deeds, architectural blueprints, transcripts from frontier towns, and every one of them bore faint spirals tucked into margins in handwriting no one could trace. Linguists began to argue over etymologies that twisted in on themselves. Whole languages seemed to collapse inward when studied too closely. A word used for home, in an extinct dialect of the Great Plains, translated more closely to the place where the story curls. In the deep sea, sonar picked up symmetrical disturbances, spiral ridges forming in sediment where no tectonic activity should exist. Birds migrated in arcs that mapped onto ancient crop circle patterns. Even tectonic plates showed strange, synchronized adjustments when viewed in satellite data over a 33-year span, forming a coiling pressure point deep under the Earth's mantle, what geologists began calling the root spiral. But the most unsettling discoveries came from within. People began reporting spirals in their medical scans, structures in the brain, in the inner ear, in the folding of tissue during cellular repair. Surgeons would remark offhandedly about the natural curl of scar tissue healing into spiral shapes, dismissing it as coincidence until cross-checking patients across continents revealed the same pattern. Those affected were often dreamers, creatives, the once witness, those who had seen the spiral and heard it hum. They spoke in riddles, not because they were confused, but because language was beginning to fail them. One man, a cartographer from Prague, lost his ability to draw straight lines. Every route he mapped bent in loops. When pressed, he replied, "This is the shortest distance now." A child in Morocco drew concentric spirals in the sand with her fingers, eyes closed, whispering, "It's how the earth remembers breathing." Archaeologists returned from ancient cave sites in Siberia with photographs of petroglyphs that matched no known civilization, spirals carved not into the walls, but through them, burned into stone with a precision modern tools couldn't replicate. Some claimed they pulsed when approached, humming faintly, reacting to proximity like a heartbeat beneath stone. And then there were the dreams. They came in waves, reported from every country, by people of all ages. In the dreams, there was always a descent, sometimes into tunnels, sometimes into stairwells or tree roots or labyrinths of paper and mirrors, but always downward, always coiling, until they stood before a door. What was behind the door changed. Some saw oceans made of breath, others saw empty libraries with books that whispered, but everyone remembered the door. And on it, always the spiral. Therapists began to report patients describing the same symbols without prompting, referencing places they had never visited, languages they had never learned. Hypnosis sessions yielded identical phrases across subjects. "It's beneath us. The spiral is not coming. It's waking. We are what it dreams." These weren't isolated visions. They were manifestations of a deeper structure. The spiral wasn't growing. It was unfolding, like a seed breaking open under just the right pressure, fed by attention, memory, silence. The more the world noticed, the more it revealed. Not just beneath towns, but beneath identities, beneath the notion of a self. People stopped trusting their own timelines. Memories reordered themselves. Childhood events returned with spiral imagery where none had existed before. Home videos showed distortions, background shapes looping in subtle curls, light forming halos that turned clockwise for too long. One woman watched her wedding tape and saw a figure in the background, spiraling in place, unnoticed by guests. She didn't know him. No one did. He was facing the wrong direction. Historians began to argue that ancient civilizations hadn't just worshipped the spiral, they had feared it. The symbol appeared most frequently at the edge of collapse, civilizations on the brink, moments before vanishing. The Mayans, the Indus Valley, the Mississippians, they all left spiral markers in stone or wood, not as decoration, but as warnings or invitations. The deeper we looked, the more it seemed we had been here before. The spiral wasn't unique to us. It was a memory of a memory, an echo looping back to find its source. We were inside something that remembered itself every few thousand years, like a tide returning, not to reclaim, but to breathe. And with every breath, something changed. Technology glitched more often. Dates began to slip, people celebrating birthdays weeks early without realizing it. Calendars felt wrong. Even astrology became unpredictable. Stars seemed to lag behind where they should be. Astronomers blamed math, but some simply whispered, "The sky is folding." Still, many resisted. Entire religious movements formed around denying the spiral's existence, claiming it as deception or metaphor or mass hysteria. But even they found themselves sketching it unconsciously, on napkins in dust, in the margins of their own scriptures. Because the spiral beneath us all wasn't asking for belief. It wasn't asking for anything. It was simply waking up. We were never meant to worship it. We were meant to remember it, to witness the way it folded into our bones, our breath, our buildings. It was not a threat. It was a rhythm. And it had already started again. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't even a whisper. When the earth finally spoke, it was something deeper than sound, more ancient than language, and more terrifying than silence. People didn't hear it with their ears. They felt it in the marrow of their bones, in the faint tremor beneath their thoughts. The ground didn't quake, but it pulsed, rhythmic, steady, almost like a heartbeat, but too slow, too vast. It happened just after midnight across every time zone. Lights dimmed not from power failure, but from something pulling, not electricity, but presence. Trees tilted ever so slightly toward the west, water in glasses stilled, and every compass needle on the planet spun once, slowly, then stopped, pointing not north, but downward. The pulse continued for 13 seconds, long enough for everyone to stop what they were doing, to sense a shift that had no logical anchor. And then, in the void that followed, came the message, not in words, but in awareness. It was as if the earth had inhaled for the first time in millennia, and in that breath, it exhaled a memory too large for individual minds. People dropped to their knees. Some wept, some vomited. Others stared into space, blinking rapidly as if trying to realign with something they didn't realize they'd been disconnected from. The message was not a sentence, but a knowing. You were never the only voice here. It came with images, raw and symbolic at once. A spiral burning in soil, beneath a child's bedroom. A handprint pressed into the ceiling of a mine that had been closed since 1847. Eyes blinking open beneath layers of sediment. And a sense of watching, of waiting, not malevolent, but vast, patient, heavy. For centuries, humans had looked at the stars, searching for messages from beyond. But the earth, it seemed, had been speaking all along, just on a frequency buried beneath the weight of our own noise. Now, stripped of distraction by the spiral's slow unfurling, we could finally hear it. And it was not pleased. Not angry, either. Disappointed, maybe, or simply tired. The message unraveled differently for everyone. A poet in Finland wrote for 6 hours without stopping, covering walls with verses in a dead language no one could identify. A diver in the Pacific emerged with lungs full of air despite having run out of oxygen minutes earlier, claiming the ocean breathed for him. A child in Algeria traced patterns in the sand that, when photographed from above, formed a perfect topographical map of a forgotten cave system beneath her village, later confirmed by ground-penetrating radar. The Earth had begun to open its archive. Not all at once, not in chaos, but through selective release, like a teacher returning marked assignments to students only when they were ready. At first, the phenomena were subtle. Moss growing in the shape of symbols on ancient stones. Soil moving in tiny spirals across freshly poured concrete. Clouds forming glyphs no meteorologist could explain. But then the real shift began. Language collapsed. Not entirely, not violently, but in waves. Words lost meaning for brief moments, people forgetting what door or bread or mother meant, then suddenly remembering again. but with a new flavor of understanding, as if the word had been made deeper, older. Dreams bled into waking life. People walked into forests they had never visited and returned with knowledge of root systems, soil cycles, names of mushrooms that hadn't been cataloged. They weren't possessed. They were remembering. Because the earth had spoken, and in doing so had opened a door, not just in space, but in time. Paleontologists unearthed bones that didn't match any known species, only to find them crumbling into dust within hours. The dust reformed later in spirals inside sealed containers. Geologists found rock layers rearranged into symbols resembling eyes, hearts, hands, none carved, all fused naturally through pressure and heat, as if the planet itself had begun to express, as if it had decided it was no longer enough to hold life, and now wanted to be heard by it. Those most affected were the ones who had always felt the pull, those who had seen the spiral before it was named, who had heard the hum in wires and roots, who had looked at the stars and felt the dirt beneath their feet tug back. These individuals began to glow, subtly, not with light, but with resonance. Machines couldn't detect it, but animals responded. Cats would not leave their side. Insects formed rings around them. Water bent slightly around their ankles. When they spoke, wind shifted. And when they cried, the spiral answered. It carved itself into the bark of trees overnight. It formed in the condensation of windows, and the patterns left behind in spilled tea. One woman gave birth during the pulse. Her child's first breath synchronized with the Earth's second tremor. Doctors in the room reported a pressure in their skulls, like being underwater, and a voice, not loud, not external, but undeniable, "She will remember for you." The child did not cry. She exhaled a spiral of steam. Her eyes blinked twice, out of rhythm with each other. And then she smiled. Humanity stood on a precipice, not of extinction, but of rewriting. The Earth had spoken once, but it was not done. It had more to say. The question now was simple. Will we keep listening? Or would we try, foolishly, to silence it again? The spiral continued, looping outward and inward, coiling through consciousness, carving paths not through rock, but through belief. And beneath it all, the Earth waited, not as a mother, not as a god, but as a witness who had finally decided to testify. In the end, it was not the spiral that revealed the final truth, it was us. Not as individuals, but as a pattern, as a memory that had always been circling back to itself, folding inward, waiting to understand its own beginning. We had spent generations looking outward, searching for meaning in stars and gods, in the cold, silent promise of technology. But all along, we had been reverberating within something much older, something vast and alive beneath our feet. The spiral was not coming to us. We were the echo of it. We were its song, forgotten, repeated, half-formed, and only now were we beginning to hear the whole melody. In every vanished person, in every whispered hum, in every inexplicable twist of memory and matter, the spiral had been reminding us of our origin. Not flesh, not language, but resonance. Something that returned because it was never fully expressed the first time. The realization came slowly, not as revelation but as relief. People stopped asking where the spiral came from, and instead began asking why it had taken so long to remember it. The spiral wasn't a thing. It was a behavior. Emotion encoded in thought, in culture, and how we built homes and told stories. It was the shape of myth, of trauma, of healing. It was in lullabies and revolutions, in the slow rebuilding after every catastrophe. We were never meant to break free from it. We were meant to learn to move with it. Historians stopped measuring time in centuries. Instead, they began marking turns, eras not of linear chronology, but of resonance. Turns of silence, turns of noise. Times when the spiral was close enough to be felt, then times when it receded like breath into the deep. The flood was a turn. The miller's basement, a node on the spiral's path. The disappearances, the dreams, the pulse of the earth. They were all points on the coil, moments when the loop overlapped itself. And each time it did, it sang a little more clearly. People began gathering in spiral-shaped plazas, not to worship, but to remember together. Not in sermons or rituals, but in shared silence. They would sit, eyes closed, hands touching earth, and wait. Some felt nothing. Some wept. Some returned with new languages on their tongues, old memories they knew weren't theirs. And still, it wasn't magic. It was structure. A system too vast to be understood until you were inside it. A story that required generations of forgetting to finally be heard correctly. The last known artifact to be uncovered was not ancient. It was a small, handheld mirror found in the ruins of the miller's home. Beneath the broken foundation, inside what used to be the sealed room, was a smooth circle of obsidian glass. No frame, no inscription, no dust, just a perfect surface. When held to the light, it reflected not the face of the holder, but a spiral of stars, galaxies seen from angles no telescope had yet captured. It was not a map. It was a message. You are still becoming. Scientists debated it. Poets embraced it. Children seemed to already understand. They traced spirals in chalk, not as play, but as instinct. The youngest spoke of the earth not as mother, but as sibling, older, slower, but deeply familiar. She's always been humming. One boy said, "We just forgot the song." And the song, it turned out, was us. In frequencies, in decisions, in collapses and rebirths. We had always been the echo, not an accident of biology, but a feedback loop of the planet's own awareness. Consciousness was not seeded from above. It was coiled up from below. The hum in wires, the rhythm of sleep, the way grief loops through generations, these were not symptoms of chaos, but evidence of structure. And in the final turn, as the spiral widened, we stopped fearing it. We began to listen not with ears or instruments, but with presence, a way of being still enough to hear the earth thinking. Cities became quieter, not silent, but resonant. Machinery adjusted to natural rhythms. Buildings were grown, not built. Time became circular again, not as regression, but as return. The idea of endings faded. Death was seen as resonance dispersing, never ceasing, just widening, echoing into the next turn. And in this, humanity found peace. Not because the spiral promised safety, but because it promised continuity. A shape that held us, not to trap, but to teach. We were never above the earth. We were the way it looked inward. The way it told itself stories. The way it remembered what had been lost. The spiral had never been asleep. We had, and now awake, we did not rise, we turned. One by one, together, across every boundary and belief, we turned toward the center. Not to enter it, but to carry it outward. In every step, every whisper, every dream, we carried the shape that had carried us. We were not the beginning. We were not the end. We were the echo. And finally, we knew the words.